Hey guys, this is Andrew with High Level Reviews, and today I'd like to take a look at the PSP version of Tactics Ogre, Let Us Cling Together. The 2011 PSP version I'll be reviewing is a remake of the original game that was released on the Super Nintendo in 1995 in Japan, and on the PlayStation in 1998 in the US. The game's creator, Yasumi Matsuno, is well known for creating narratives that focus on human drama and political deviousness, while certainly still including heavy doses of mysticism and mythology, and in the case of Final Fantasy Tactics, relying on it heavily in the second portion of the game, perhaps to its detriment. When designing Tactics Ogre, his idea was to ground the story firmly in human tragedy and create events and groups loosely based on the Yugoslav wars and the Bosnian genocide. Matsuno was heavily interested in world history, especially Western. The result was a continual blurring of the lines between traditionally held ideas of good and evil, and a far more nuanced approach to tired morality systems. The approach helped distance this release from the first Ogre battle, which focused on much larger groups of characters and incorporated gods and demons more prevalently. The game was received well in Japan, but didn't make it to the West until 1998, where it was, hilariously enough, viewed as a derivative copy of Final Fantasy Tactics, which was in actuality the spiritual successor to Tactics Ogre and directed by Matsuno himself. Hiroshi Minagawa was tasked with directing the PSP remake of Tactics Ogre and had to assemble the original team, including Matsuno, who worked on game design and new story elements. The staff allowed the fanbase to influence many new features and enhancements in the new version, such as a more forgiving death penalty, losing characters was a huge point of contention in the original, an easier way to experience the multiple paths, massive battle system changes, toned down difficulty in general, a lot of redone art and more impressive spells while still retaining the 2D sprites, but with richer colors and textures, and many revamped systems and a more fleshed out narrative and superior faux Shakespearean translation. In fact, it's almost an entirely different game aside from the plot and battle maps. Minagawa even stated that Matsuno and him were able to include nearly everything they wanted to. It was an omnibus of sorts, and because of this, he considered it to be at the forefront of the tactics history and genre. While it certainly has some frustrating aspects, particularly class balance, I'd have to agree after over 100 hours in the game, it has more replayability than I've ever seen in a strategy RPG. The game starts by focusing on a small group led by Denam Pavel, his sister Quechua, and his friend Vice. The three concoct a plan of revenge on the Dark Knights Lothlorien and find themselves in the thick of a complicated geopolitical struggle where the major differences between the ethnic groups are their regions and alignments, rather than significant cultural disparities in physical appearance, which is precisely how Matsuno intended it to be. There are gut-wrenching scenes of horrendous war crimes, including ethnic cleansing and mental and physical torture. The result left the narrative feeling more historically informed, more literary, and far more convincing. There are several scenes with impoverished groups begging for peace and a cessation to violence and war, but only end up getting trampled on by the power-hungry ascending nobles. Matsuno stated that he didn't want to make another morality play where the player has to defeat evil, that he wanted to create a world where good and evil are very ambiguous and hard to discern, which would make a more layered drama. There are several different major and minor decisions the player must make that will determine the path he or she is on and has immediate plot and gameplay effects. While the different paths, lawful, neutral, and chaotic, certainly can't and shouldn't be interpreted as evil or good, each contain very tough decisions. Lawful is best understood as duty-bound and loyal to authority, often introducing the ethical theory of consequentialism, that the end justified the means, while the chaotic route routinely leans towards idealism and going with your heart, often violently rebelling when a leader requests to place aside idealism for a more pragmatic, but often sacrificial, approach to a problem. Again, it's the nuance here that makes these paths so interesting. Aside from the extreme example of genocide, most of the crucial decision-making moments aren't as simplistic or straightforward as you'd imagine. Though the chaotic path is repeatedly and erroneously conflated with the good path, it often blurs the line between liberation and terrorism in very heady ways, usually involving entire armies referring to Denam as a murderer, or clearly showing a wildly different perspective, though a manipulated one, but still very real for Denam's enemies. The game does an excellent job humanizing what would otherwise be faceless villains by briefly describing their history in the Warren Report, which operates as a database for the events, people, personal encounters, and races of Valeria. This edition also had gameplay implications, as checking it periodically opened up new areas and further detailed complicated political and military situations, thus creating a wonderful back and forth relationship between checking the report to learn about the world and checking the report to further enhance one's army. While I do wish that certain characters had been developed further and explored more thoroughly, this might have helped establish a more believable basis for the character shifts the player sees through the different paths, but Tactics Ogre's main concern is to demonstrate the pain and suffering those not in charge of tactical maneuvers or backroom dealings go through, and to expose how truly inconsequential the differences between the groups at war are, and in that regard, it succeeds beautifully. The first game's opaque and difficult systems were overhauled in many ways, designed to be less frustrating and less punishing. While this might elicit a moan or two from the hardcore crowd, plenty of challenges still exist, and it has probably the most robust post-game content of any non-MMO I've ever experienced. Both Matsuno and Minagawa wanted to further emphasize the simulation elements of the game while still changing a lot about the combat, and that's precisely what happened. The game plays like a pretty standard strategy RPG in many ways. The player moves across a grid, controlling individual units, and targets enemies with spells, abilities, attacks, and can use items from an inventory. The field kept its isometric view, but can now be rotated and transitioned into an overhead view for a better take on the overall battlefield, which is sometimes depressingly necessary. Turn order is determined by RT for recovery time. The lower RT, the faster the character, with a few other minor influencers, such as the weight of equipment. Not performing an action when it is your turn, or only moving a few squares, can also bring about another turn faster. Spells can be tossed out by using a scroll of the corresponding spell, which then teaches that spell, if learnable, to the character that used it. These spells require mana, which builds up between turns, with plenty of abilities used to enhance this growth. Class-based skills are learned, though not as many as other SRPGs often have, and when used, consume TP. TP is also used when performing a finishing move, which are lethal over-the-top moves the character learns after leveling up their proficiency with a specific weapon. It is essentially an imported version of Vagrant Story's break art system. You are allowed to use skills, act, which is usually an attack, and move once per turn. This allows the player to enhance an action with specific skills and grants a lot of tactical diversity in many situations. Again, though, not as many as other games might provide. Classes are accessed through class marks, which are cards that become available in the shop or are dropped from defeated enemies. There are mostly straightforward classes, but several unique and niche ones do exist. Several are also quite difficult to obtain. Each character has also a maximum of 10 skill slots, and must choose from a massive list, often containing a ton of passives, to fill that up. While this is a smooth and highly functional system, it suffers from some major clarity issues in regards to skill usages and intricacies, often obfuscating the math involved, which in fairness isn't uncommon in RPGs, and making a lot of skills and abilities feel inconsistent, which typically is simply a failure to understand how certain aspects of the system are interacting. For instance, leveling up a character's proficiency in a magic type offers pretty noticeable damage increases, and when you couple this with augmented strength against a monster type, it gets even more impressive. Bringing in a new character with comparable stats and better equipment can still see them inflicting painfully less damage than a character with higher proficiency in specific areas. The game didn't quite stress how truly paramount these proficiencies are, and so characters that will become more powerful, which are the unique units in the game, often require some tedious grinding to bring up to par with generics and early uniques that the player got in the beginning of the game. Couple that with the fact that if the character has a new class that you want to keep, you'll be starting with that character from level 1. The flip side is that any levels gained in that class are persistent for any other character that changes into it, even if they just joined your party. This kind of creates an interesting rhythm in the game. Get a new class you like, level it up, bring in any new uniques and advance the story a bit with the class you like. I did this with ninjas because they're quite unfair. Get a new class late game and do the same thing. While that gets monotonous and laborious for some, admittedly it can kind of dissuade the player from experimenting with a class because of how long it takes to really see classes and individual units come together in Tactics Ogre, once done or once you've caught it up. So long as you continue to use that class in your main party, you'll never have to do that again for that particular class. The game also offers a sizable boost in XP when using multiples of the same class, though with classes that are difficult to find, this might not be much of an option. What I found to be more problematic was the equipping of 10 skills, again mostly dominated by passives that become necessary to survive mid to late game, from an often enormous list of very detailed and situational skills, and some excellent broad ones for sure. I'm not suggesting that once learned all of them should have been usable, that would be absurd, but perhaps making decisions a little more clear before a battle would have been nice. Going in with augmented damage to a kind only to see none of them in a fight is a little disheartening. And with how crucial these enhancements in damage can be in certain encounters, for instance, I found that it was really swinging my mage and archer's damage wildly against dragons, it only highlights that oversight and frustration. I think I would have preferred slightly less overall skills, and certainly less passives. This creates a lack of in-battle payoff as you can be strong, but not get to use any really cool or visually pleasing abilities typically accompanying high-tier units. But perhaps a higher buy-in price to gain the use of them perpetually. SP is earned at a pretty high rate after winning a battle. Grinding it all often gets you nearly everything you'll need in the meantime, even as higher tiers of abilities and passives open up. Despite that criticism, and it is just a personal one, I'll say that a plethora of passives and situational abilities creates clearly defined roles for units, something plenty of strategy RPGs don't do or simply don't want to do. Even some of the stronger units in the game, the ninja and archer for instance, start to show clear-cut weaknesses against certain enemy types and terrains. The game often tends to put you at an extreme height disadvantage so that archers have a hard time landing a shot, almost as if they knew how crazy archers were. It feels more, as Minagawa and Matsuno claimed they wanted, like a war simulation than an intimate miniature war god creator. Each unit is designed to fill a role. Even the less popular builds of classes have pretty detailed and functional uses, and how they go about achieving that end is up to the player. Yes, there are fair gripes about class progression, especially how ineffectual by comparison soft armor healers start to become, but there are simply so many viable options in the game that not playing it optimally isn't that big of a problem at all. Most players, myself included, don't want to feel forced into pass in order to succeed, though this can happen in some ways near the very end of the post-game content, but that's after nearly 200 hours of gameplay. The game also contains a rewind of sorts called the Chariot System, allowing the player to return to a move as far as 50 back. It's essentially a quick redo for a misstep. This, however, upset some of the more hardcore fans as they felt it was babying the less cerebral players. This demographic was placated with an in-game title for not using the Chariot System at all. While I get the consternation, it made the game far more accessible and still forces the player to try a different move or strategy after failing. Simply trying to play the percentages and redo the same move doesn't work, it yields the same result. This also thematically fits. It is a wonderful complement to the World Tarot system, allowing the player to experience different outcomes. There is also a crafting system. While I like to avoid unnecessarily harsh criticism, as sometimes it's hard to truly understand the intent of creative minds, this edition was an incredibly underdeveloped and superficial aspect that was so clearly shoehorned in to add the claim that the new Tactics Ogre featured crafting. It's uninspired, simply put. Most ingredients can be purchased in the shop, so it's merely an exercise in menu hopping and teeth grinding until late game. Why not make the items that have purchasable ingredients just available for purchase in the store? There was also no ability to craft in bulk, even if you had the necessary ingredients. It just didn't make much sense to me. Despite some clearly frustrating qualms, I couldn't put this game down. The late game content and the coda missions, which form an epilogue of sorts, as the name suggests, ends up expanding on the core experience to the extent that I actually started to view the game's structure differently, though those that play through the story and don't continue still experience a gem. It felt like the entire story section of the game was actually in preparation for the depth and breadth of the post-game content. You'll unfortunately need to make a lot of adjustments to play more optimally and acquire the stronger units to see all of the content, but that goal works pristinely when coupled with the World Tarot's ability to send you to a prior event, and thus open up recruitment of previously barred characters. If one feels the game trending towards the easy side when cruising through the branching stories, just wait until you're exploring the post-game dungeon, stumbling into terrifying creatures with subpar generics. The game opens up and presents you with another 50 to 75 hours worth of content, and this portion of the game is where many of those specific abilities I bemoaned earlier start to see more tactical use, such as abilities that lower a character's chance of being charmed. It's no doubt a title with plenty of clarification issues, especially for the more numbers-obsessed players, but it ranks very high for me among combat systems I've played that left me feeling like I could never finish all it had to offer, and that's a rare trait. Hitoshi Sakamoto and Masahiro Iwata did a superb job composing the original soundtrack, and despite the occasional clumsy placement of a track, returned for the PSP remake to increase the sound quality and add substantial length to the already recognized greats of the composition. While not as revered or highly praised as Sakamoto and Iwata's work on Final Fantasy Tactics, I was still blown away by the pair's ability to capture such a wide array of motions. From intense edge-of-your-seat battle tracks to pieces that poignantly convey and enhance the utter despair and heartbreak being captured on screen. It reminds me a lot of Sakimoto's work on Final Fantasy XII. It's a superb soundtrack. Though existing in a subgenre that is often castigated for its inaccessibility, the PSP version of Tactics Ogre, while certainly keeping some of the original's vague tendencies, created a title that is rewarding to both the hardcore and the casual gamer. I was blown away by the time I invested, but it didn't feel like a slog or a chore. I spent way more time than I typically take to finish a game, but enjoyed every moment of it. Matsuno's efforts to imbue the story with grounded drama and branching paths that don't separate into facile morality alignments were admirable, and added an element not often felt in video games, specifically JRPGs. Though I do admire and certainly loved the original, the PSP version is fantastic and worth every penny spent. If you have any interest in strategy RPGs, Matsuno style, or deep commentaries on War and Clash, you must experience this game. If you enjoyed the review, don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment. My Twitter is also located right below the video. This has been Andrew with High Level Reviews, and I appreciate you guys stopping by.